Welcome to the Cairn. I'm Ben Walker. This is where we sit down with leaders navigating real challenges, people thinking seriously about the future and what it takes to balance people, process and technology when everything's changing. Each episode we explore how leaders actually build strategy, drive real change and get things done in an increasingly uncertain landscape. Whether they're transforming education or revolutionising patient care, these are the conversations with people getting it done. Practical thinking, real outcomes. This is the Cairn. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Cairn. I'm Ben Walker. Today we're talking about something every professional is facing. How do you navigate a career when the landscape keeps shifting under your feet? The World Economic Forum says 60% of the workforce will need significant reskilling by 2030. That's not a distant future. It's happening right now. But here's what's interesting. Some professionals are thriving through this disruption. They're not just reacting, they're pivoting with intention, stacking skills that create real optionality and building careers that align with what matters to them. My guest today is Sonia Passmore. She founded Pick a Path, a career strategy platform based here in New Zealand. Sonia works with professionals navigating major transitions, people figuring out which skills to develop, how to pivot without starting from scratch, and increasingly how to build meaningful careers that offer flexibility and focus. She's also witnessed industry disruption firsthand, working in television as it transformed from traditional broadcasting to digital platforms. Sonia, thanks for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to be here. Thank you.
So let's kick straight in. You founded Pick a Path in 2020, right as the world was turning upside down. What were you seeing then that made you think people need this kind of support? And how has that changed over the last 6 years?
Yeah, it's a good question because, wow, what a time that was. When COVID hit, what I guess I noticed straight away wasn't that people had lost capability. It was that they'd lost certainty. Overnight, work changed physically through remote and hybrid setups. But I guess like the deeper impact was psychological. People suddenly felt vulnerable. They were questioning whether their roles would still exist, whether their skills were still relevant, and whether they even knew how to explain the value that they brought anymore. So a lot of people tied their identity very closely to their role. And when that role felt unstable, everything else started wobble. Pick a Path really came out of, seeing highly capable professionals lose confidence. And not because they weren't good at what they did, but because the context around their work had shifted so quickly. So I guess what has changed since then is that disruption is no longer a moment in time. It's the environment. Today, people are navigating restructures, AI, cost cutting, and shifting expectations, and all at once. The work now is about helping people build careers that can adapt without their confidence or sense of identity taking a hit every time something is changing.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that was real disruption. Nowadays, there's probably more of a focus on pivots and changes in careers. Can you give us a bit of a breakdown? As in, when someone comes to you feeling stuck or uncertain, how do you figure out what the best path for them is? What path do you help them start to take?
Yeah. Most people arrive thinking that they need a complete career change. In reality, it's actually quite rare. A career change usually means that you're starting again. So a new industry, new credibility, often a reset financially and even emotionally. A pivot, on the other hand, builds on what's already there, right? It's about using existing skills, experience, and judgment in a different context or shape. So to work out which one someone might be facing, we don't start by talking about future job titles. That often keeps people stuck. So instead, we look backwards. So what problems do people consistently trust you with? Where do you add the most value? What parts of your work energizes you and which parts drain you? For example, do you want an example? A project manager might think that they want to leave their profession entirely. But when we look closely, they often want to leave the constant delivery pressure, so not the skills themselves. So that's usually a pivot, not a change.
Interesting. That all makes much sense. So For you, you've in your career, you've had some pivots as well. And I know that you've
Oh,
worked in television. And at that time, there was some serious disruption as well as traditional broadcasting moved through to digital platforms. What did that experience teach you about how people navigate change?
yeah, no, definitely. And a lot of that comes back to that sense of sort of identity. It's like tying your identity to one specific role title. It was a really interesting time. I mean, we're talking, how long ago was that now? It was a number of years. And now it feels like change is it's commonplace, right? We're just having to navigate it and it's probably never going to change. So back then, seeing this shift, it was like, it's crazy. We're going from television and they're having to learn how to adapt to digital. So of course, it was a completely different landscape. But I guess the experience taught me how deeply people connect their sense of identity to their work. So during those restructures, people weren't struggling because they lacked skill or resilience. It was simply struggling because the roles they were known for were disappearing. So colleagues were questioning where they fitted, what they had to offer outside of a specific role, and whether their experience still mattered. And that shows up strongly in the work that I do now. So a big part of what I help people do is separate who they are from the role that they've been doing. And once people can see their value isn't tied to a single title or organization, they regain a sense of agency and possibility and, even in uncertain environments.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And I guess we're living in a world that's continuously changing now.
Mhm.
And increasingly, people's roles are changing. So when professionals come to you worried about being left behind in this sort of change, whether it's AI industry shifts or moving to digital broadcasting,
Mm.
and they feel that their skills or their particular role are becoming obsolete, where do you start? What's the first question that you ask?
Yeah, again, it is a good question. So I think the point there is I start by grounding the conversation and reality rather than fear. So the first question I might ask is, what do people come to you for? Not what's written in your job description, but when something is unclear or complex or under pressure, where do people seek you out? So that usually surfaces things like judgment or problem solving and context, not tools or technology. So once people can see that clearly, the panic sort of settles. So from there, we can have a much more sort of useful conversation about what genuinely needs to evolve rather than reacting to things like headlines about AI or disruption. And it's an easier conversation, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I hear a lot of noise about upskilling and reskilling, and I don't really understand the difference. But when someone needs to come to you to reskill, how do you figure out what to focus on, and how do you go about that?
Yeah, totally. I think you could define reskilling and upskilling. So, reskilling, you might be reskilling in a similar job, but learning more information about it, especially now in these times when naturally jobs are changing. And then upskilling might be understanding where there might be a gap in your skill set, or you might want to learn a new skill that could take you somewhere else. But again, there's probably a fine line. But I guess in practice, reskilling is about being selective, so not reactive. So I see a lot of people enrolling in courses because they feel like they're behind or not because the skill actually aligns with their strengths or the market. So we start by looking at what might already work. So if someone is strong in, say, stakeholder engagement, we might layer in change or transformation capability. If they're analytical, we might build communication or influence on top of that. So reskilling works best when it essentially compounds existing strengths rather than scattering attention. So the goal isn't to collect skills, it's to make what you already do or what you already do well more valuable and more visible.
That makes sense. So for me, when I'm thinking about upskilling, then I'm probably thinking about, hey, look, in my world, how can I leverage AI to do my job in a better way? How can I gain some additional skills so I can be
Mhm.
better at the things that I'm already good at? And reskilling is more like transferring my skills into areas where I have some competency or potentially skills that might be, I guess, a word that you've used, I've seen in some of your blogs, is transferable skills mapping.
Yes.
So when you
Yeah.
can start to map these things across, can you tell us a little bit more about that concept?
Yeah, definitely. I guess where I start with transferable skills, it's essentially stripping back again. We're coming back to this whole thing around job titles, right? So we're stripping back from that job title. And we are often, I said that really limits like how someone sees themselves, right? If they're aligning with only a job title. So instead of that, we focus on the work underneath. So things like analyzing information or influencing decisions or prioritizing under pressure, even managing complexity. So when we're talking about transferable skills, it's essentially all the skills that you could take that you're using in, say, your current role, and you can translate them into another position. An example could be a teacher who brings learning, design, and communication, because they could essentially be doing training thing during their time as a teacher, but they could actually go into instructional design and be doing training manuals for organizations outside of that. A healthcare professional brings systems thinking and prioritization, or even a project manager brings coordination and risk management. So once these skills are clearly named and people can look at the roles they're drawn to, they can realistically assess what translates and what gaps might exist. And then those gaps then become specific and manageable rather than an overwhelming thing to look at.
That's interesting. So you're talking a lot about the human skills in terms of potentially adaptability and some of the skills that they've developed through life experience, not necessarily through technical learning or study. Is there an element of that sort of technical skill set and study in certain areas, or is it more the human elements that matter in terms of that mapping?
Oh, look, that's really interesting. I think it can be a bit of both. I don't think it's one or the other. I certainly think that technology can open doors, but we need that sort of human capability. And that's what helps us translate those tools. And if we're talking about AI or something like that, if I could use a really sort of simple example, it could be like we all know how to use ChatGPT, but without using our own judgment and without making decisions around how we're using it or what we're putting into it, it's a completely different process, right? We're actually needing to use our own judgment. And that's what is making this sort of like technology more human. And I believe that is something that we're going to need to hold on to.
Sonia, something I've been thinking about and something you've written about a little bit as well is I guess, the growth of fractional roles. And in some ways, it relates to transferable skills. Because I know when I'm working in a fractional capacity, I might be working for various different businesses across various different sectors, but I have transferable skills that I can apply into these different businesses. Have you seen fractional leadership and roles within organizations on a contract basis, I'll say, or an engagement basis grow over the last few years?
There has been, there's been a huge increase in fractional work. And look, I think there from both sides, there's definitely like a benefit in it. I think from an organization side, it works really well in New Zealand because I think we've got a smaller labor market, and I think when senior leaders hit a certain level, there's less roles for them to take on full time, right? So it's forcing them to think about how can we work differently. Great for organizations that perhaps can't afford a senior leader in a full-time capacity, right? So essentially then they can hire someone for a couple of days a week. But the thing about fractional is that it's really based on capability, right? So you're not hiring someone, just for two days. You're hiring them based on what they're able to do and get done for you. And then flipping it around to someone that might be in a fractional or looking for that fractional, that some of the I guess some of the benefits for someone looking to get into that fractional kind of work, there's flexibility and autonomy, and they're not having to take on 60 hours a week. They can look at how it fits into their life, much better. And so that the flip side of that is then they're also having to go, is it going to provide enough security? What does that mean for me? Might not be consistent, and is it a safe option?
Yeah. So I guess there's a degree of risk in that, and people have to have a little bit of confidence in themselves. They need to be backing themselves if they're going to essentially setting up on their own rather than being employed by
Mm.
one organization. Do you see people thinking about this as a viable option on an increasing basis, or is it changing more gradually than that?
I think it's obvious that there's definite increases and there are people thinking about it. I think a lot of the people that I work with are generally at points where they're definitely thinking, okay, well, what does this next step look like for me? And with a limited market in New Zealand, some of their options might be heading into, say, governance work or looking at those shorter term. So, yes, 100%. I think that that is part of it. And then you've got, yeah, outside of that, then they're like, what does moving overseas might look like?
Mm.
But yes, I am having these conversations more and what that might. And you know what? Sometimes I actually think that it is a little bit organic for these leaders because by the time I'm having these conversations with them, they've actually already been doing, they're in governance as well as doing their full time job. So in fact, it could be more of an organic kind of growth thing rather than going, right, okay, I'm going to go into fractional work. It's actually already making those steps. So yeah.
Fantastic. So one of the things that you mentioned is essentially around values and purpose and ensuring that people are well aligned to their future direction and the career conversations that you're having. Can you tell me a little bit about, in a little bit more detail, about why that is so important? Why, and if you steer away the conversation from things like salary or any other aspects?
So without values, people tend to make short term decisions, and short term decisions that don't last. So salary and security matter, especially during uncertainty, but values act as a filter. So they help people decide not just what they can do, but what they want to live with over time. So workload, boundaries, trade offs, and impact. I think that's kind of it.
Here's an additional question, just off the back of that one, Sonia.
Mm.
One of the things I'm noticing, I have 3 young children and they're starting to think about the paths that they will take in life. And I know they've got friends that are starting to move into tertiary education and maybe into work. It's interesting to hear from them the things that they're considering as they start to put together their future careers.
Mm.
Have you seen changes in the way that the younger generations are starting to consider jobs and what's important to them versus potentially people who have been in working life essentially for 20 years?
Yeah. You know what? This is such an interesting one because even when I headed into university, it was very much like the ideal back then was to you get into a job, you study, you get into a job, and you stay in that job for a really long time. And that was seen as, oh, okay, so if you did make a change at any point, it would be like, how long were you in the last job? Because that was seen as a positive, right? It showed that you were committed and all these things. And now it has shifted. It's shifted a lot because now employers are actually looking at the skills and how much you're actually developing along the way. Coming back to your question about the kids, I guess I was coming to that sort of, it was always like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a dancer. And it was like this one thing, right?
Mm.
Whereas now that has changed. Even with AI, it's like you can be many things, right? And you can have many skills. And one of the things that I've also found an interesting take. So instead of asking your kids, what do you want to be? You could ask them, what impact do you want to make? And I think it's a really interesting question because you're getting them to actually unpack a little bit more about what impact do I want to make in the world rather than what do I want to be. And again, it comes back to that role title, right?
Yeah. And I guess in the same sort of vein, there's subjects at school that my kids hate
Yeah.
and subjects that they love. I guess as people come to you, as they're having changes in their lives and their careers, etc., do you find that there's people pivoting away from things as well as pivoting towards things? And how do you navigate that with them?
Yeah, definitely. So we listen carefully to the language that people use. So if the focus is mostly on what they're trying to escape, a boss, a workload, an environment, that's usually an escape pivot. When someone can clearly articulate what they're moving toward, the pivot tends to be more stable. So intention, why I like to think about intention creates direction, and direction makes change sustainable. It is important. I think what can come into that is if people are kind of panicking because they're in a situation which is just, it's not good, it's likely that they will make a decision and go into a similar situation, right? Because they're just trying to get away from something that's not aligning with them anymore. So having that intention, often at that point, it's a moment of pausing and going, okay, and trying to move them from that quickly, I've got to get out of something, to, okay, let's really work out what it is that you're moving toward.
Okay. In a similar sort of vein, you may have people come to you that are wanting to pivot towards something potentially more meaningful, or where they can achieve better work-life balance, but potentially their financial situation or their progression over many years at work has taken them in a different direction. How do you navigate that sort of tension?
Yeah, and it's a really common situation. We might want to do something, but financially or on a practical side, it's just, how does this work? I guess the first thing is normalizing that tension straight away. It is very common, especially during a transition. And again, often values will guide this direction, but finances will guide the timing. It might mean staying in a role longer than you'd like, or just making a staged shift. Progress doesn't need to happen all at once to be real, So again, it's probably being a little bit strategic about how that might look moving forward.
And sometimes people just need a bit of a plan, don't they? They need to get it down on paper, think about it, out loud, get it out in the open, and actually think, right, these are the steps that I'm going to take to be where I want to be in a pragmatic way.
Yeah, true. And just, just having that conversation, because, sometimes people haven't articulated that, and so sometimes it's just them having a conversation with someone and hearing yourself say stuff. I guess, on my side of that, you can start recognizing patterns, but again, I'm not there to solve to provide that answer for them. So I guess having that conversation can often help them say what might be
Absolutely.
going on about that.
And I guess the other side of this is the employers. So if we're thinking about some of the leaders in these organizations, and potentially some of their people are coming and having a chat to you about their options and their careers and their lives, what do you think those leaders in those organizations could be doing differently to better set up their employees, their teams to thrive, essentially?
Yeah, it's a good question. It does come up for me a fair bit in the conversations that I'm having with people, because they're coming to me at a point of burnout, and a lot of that is that I hear from my experiences through lack of transparency or just huge workloads. But I guess, many leaders might worry about having these kind of conversations that might accelerate people leaving. But I guess the most important thing that they could be doing is creating that space. So even asking about learning or curiosity and sustainability, not just retention. So when these conversations happen early, people start to feel supported rather than defensive, and outcomes are often better for everyone.
Yeah, interesting. And the people that you're working with at Pick a Path, do you find that for the most part they haven't felt supported in their existing roles, or are there a proportion that feel like they've picked the wrong direction and they want to change?
I think it's a real combination, and it depends on at which point they're coming to see me. If I'm seeing someone who's been made redundant, so that might be in some of the outplacement work, they're at a very different point in their transition to someone that's actively, come and booked a session with me or with any of the team. So someone that's been made redundant is being forced into a change, right? So they're going to take a minute to grieve that, in a sense. William Bridges, who is an author, he talks about the ending of something. There's not a lot of stuff in the career space. The ending, and then the pause in the middle, and then the beginning of something else. So often, if I'm seeing people in that sort of redundancy space, they're still very much at the ending. And so before I'm able to even engage that point of what's this next step going to look like for you, we're actually having to sit in that place of grieving and getting underneath those sort of role titles and stuff like that, so that we can kind of build that, that confidence. If someone has reached out and they're actively looking for work and they're wanting help, they're sitting in that middle state, or even at the beginning of, okay, this is a new beginning. And that's a really different sort of psychological state that they're at.
Thinking about AI and the impact that you've seen AI having for some of these people, I know I will work with groups of people and there will be an element, a small number, that have a bit of fear and anxiety around what AI may bring for them. Looking ahead at the future of work, whether it's AI or automation or other things, do you think that leaders and organizations need to do certain things to help their people thrive?
Yes, yeah, I do. I think there's a need to focus on sort of relevance, helping people stay relevant, not just employed. And that can happen through having honest conversations, skill development, and flexible structures. When organizations invest in relevance, people and organizations adapt together rather than drifting apart. So, yeah, I think that they're the conversations that can be happening.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sonia.
Yeah.
We've covered a whole bunch there, and that's been absolutely wonderful to talk to you. I've got one final question for you, and you're going to have to reflect a little bit on I guess, on the tail end of our conversation, what you think. I'll just ask the question. In the age of AI, what's
Yes.
the one trait that you feel defines human leadership?
In the age of AI, that's a good question.
And take your time. That's perfectly fine.
I actually think it's transparency. Do you know? I think there is a whole thing around upskilling and everything like that and staying relevant. But I think as a leader during this time, I think being open and honest and not pretending that you know everything. You don't need to have the whole answer. I think that a whole lot of things can stem from that. Yeah, trust and culture, and from the work that I'm doing and hearing what people are experiencing in their teams and in their cultures. I think that's essentially the word that comes to my mind. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Sonia. I really appreciate having such a thoughtful conversation with you today about navigating career transitions and building resilience through things like skill stacking and designing work that aligns with what matters most to the individuals, but also taking into account everything else that they might have on their plate at the same time, and ultimately forming a plan that's going to work for them. And that's been really insightful for me, and I can't wait to re-listen to this, because I always love listening to the podcast the second time because I gain twice as much back. So if you'd like to connect with Sonia and explore Pick a Path's services, you can find her at pickapath.co.nz and Sonia Passmore and Pick a Path on LinkedIn. And is there any other location, Sonia?
I've got many, but LinkedIn is good. So there's my personal LinkedIn, but there's also a company site on there, Pick a Path as well, and my website are probably the best. Yeah.
Thanks for listening, and thanks so much, Sonia. Until next time.
Great.
Thank
you, Ben. Thanks.
That's the kid. Thanks for listening. If you found this conversation valuable, share it with a leader at your network who needs to hear it. Subscribe wherever you listen to stay updated on the next conversation. Visit game.nz for show notes, resources, and more. Connect with us on LinkedIn or Instagram for updates in between episodes. I'm Ben Walker. We'll be back soon with another conversation that matters. See you then.